I'm Jim Reardon-Anderson. I'm the dean here. I want to take this moment to welcome you all to the Liberal State in the Indian Ocean. This is our annual faculty research conference, and we're delighted to have all of you here for this event. I especially want to thank some of our financial supporters, including the Qatar National Research Fund and Dr. Michael Rexelak, who's here with us today and who will share some views with you, as well as the India Initiative at Georgetown University, which is supporting this conference, and of course the Faculty Research Fund of the School of Foreign Service in Qatar, which is paying most of the bills and supporting the academic scholarship of the faculty, in particular Harry Verhoeven and Anatole Levin, the co-chairs of this enterprise, who are among our bright lights in the faculty and who are leading an initiative to, I won't say revive, but to advance the study of the Indian Ocean. I'm personally very interested in this project, and my goal in life is to get out of the deanship and get back to the faculty. And one of the reasons that I want to do so and I want to stay in Qatar is precisely to focus on the history of the Indian Ocean. I'm traditionally a Chinese historian, and I will tell you about area studies in America. You know, area studies in the United States got its big kick forward after Sputnik, the launching of the satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957. And the reaction of the Americans was to get scared and to undertake a national rejuvenation of its scholarly enterprise, including this widespread support for area studies. Well, area studies meant chopping up the world in landed pieces, such as China or East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and so forth. And neglected in that whole enterprise, that focus on landed areas took scholars like myself. I was a young PhD candidate in the 1960s, and those of us who were part of that enterprise were kind of sucked into focusing on the history, politics, literature, and culture of those landed areas, and neglected were largely the water areas that link various landed foci together. Well, I'm delighted to say that those days are now somewhat past us, and there's a much greater appreciation today for the role of the oceans in linking together various area studies. Thomas and I were discussing earlier the leadership provided by Atlantic studies in the United States, which has really looked much more closely at the relationship between the New World, North and South America, Africa, and Europe. But you know, the Atlantic is a latecomer to ocean integration, whereas the Indian Ocean was the beginning of a kind of large-scale integration of large regional areas from very early times. And so as a historian, it's very timely and appropriate that we should return to the study of the Indian Ocean as a integrating center for these areas, these landed areas that are on the periphery, including, but not exclusively, South Asia, which will be a center of this conference. At the same time, the Indian Ocean, I think the appreciation for the Indian Ocean from a security point of view has been revived. As you're well aware, the single most important line of communication in terms of total trade is between the Gulf and East Asia, passing across the Indian Ocean and through the South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, up to China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and East Asia. And as a consequence, that is another reason that the Indian Ocean has become an area of particular interest both to governments and to scholars. So both from a historical point of view and from a contemporary point of view, I think there is good reason to pay greater attention to the Indian Ocean as an integrating highway linking together these landed areas. And I must say, I'm both glad that Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Qatar has taken this mission as an important point of view for their scholarly enterprise, and I'm very lucky to be here at this time, because I'm also going to be part of this. I wanted to say a special word of thanks to Hagar Raka, who is the person who made this whole enterprise possible. She is the administrator of the faculty and has played a major role in making sure everybody got here safely, as did Omar Al-Swedi, who is our champion of all things visas and has played a major role in keeping this enterprise going. And on the events side, Bradley Bauer has been our events coordinator and has done a magnificent job both with this project and with others. And of course, our faculty leadership, our faculty chair, Dr. Amira Sanbal, and one of our faculty leaders, Rugaya Abu Sharaf, have both played an important role in helping put this enterprise together. So, so that's all you have to hear from me. You'll be glad to know that I'm done and that you can now move on to more important things. And so let me get back to the business of being dean, shuffling paper, looking at listening to problems, and not engaging in anything nearly as interesting as you all are going to have in the next few days. But thank you all for coming.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. I'm very much aware that you're really here to listen to Professor Hansen, and so I will try to keep it well under the 10 minutes that I have been allotted. But especially for the people who are not from Qatar, I would like to interest some of you in the programs that the Qatar National Research Fund is funding. And so please bear with me for the next 6 to 7 minutes as I give you a little bit of background and say a bit about this conference workshop. The dean just left, but we have another dean here, Dean Al-Malki. Welcome, distinguished guests, speakers, and students. On behalf of the Executive Director of the Qatar National Research Fund, Dr. Abdul Sattar Al-Tai, I'm welcoming you to this QNRF-sponsored workshop on the liberal state and its alternatives in the Indian Ocean world. The Qatar National Research Fund, established 10 years ago, advances knowledge and education by providing funding opportunities for original, competitively selected research and development at all levels and across all disciplines, with an emphasis on the 4 pillars of the Qatar National Research Strategy. And those are health and life sciences, social sciences, arts and humanities, energy and environment, computer sciences, and ICT. Programs and projects funded by QNRF have generated multiple benefits for Qatar. Research results are helping to improve education and health, spurred technological innovation and adoption, have conserved vital natural assets, and created intellectual property. Research-based education has placed students in a discovery-oriented environment, exposed them, we hope, to the cutting edge of knowledge, and is giving them intellectual and problem-solving skills that are preparing them for leadership roles in business, government, the arts, and other sectors of life in Qatar. All of this is in pursuit of the objective to create an ever better educated and well-trained workforce of men and women in Qatar who will provide a strong foundation for a broader economic base and the growth of new enterprise in Qatar as it's moving towards the goal of a knowledge-based economy as outlined in the Qatar National Vision 2030. We achieved this with a portfolio of funding opportunities that balance investigator-driven projects with specifically themed calls directed at Qatar's grand challenges. The National Priorities Research Program, NPRP, our flagship program, tackles needs and challenges that local research end users face, supports projects with tangible impacts to Qatar and the region, promotes a public-private partnership culture in Qatar, and encourages a more cross-cutting, interdisciplinary approach to projects. It stimulates scientific excellence and the advancement of knowledge in Qatar and raises Qatar's profile within the international research community, and all of you who traveled here are proof of that. The Undergraduate Research Experience Program seeks to stimulate a broad array of undergraduate research opportunities within Education City and Qatar University through faculty and other researcher-led projects involving one or more undergraduate students. There are a couple of new programs that some of you may be interested in. OSRA, an annual research grant focused on the Arab family and family policy-related issues. The goal of OSRA is to encourage research aimed at developing a knowledge base on the Arab family, focusing on marriage and family structure, parenting, family work balance, and family laws and practices, including issues such as divorce, that can be used for the development of evidence-based policies and programs to promote the well-being of the family. And Path to Personalized Medicine, which supports and advances research that aims to provide tailored healthcare for patients based on their genetic profile to guide decisions made in regard to prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of disease. Of course, today we are attending an event sponsored through our CWSP program, Conference and Workshop Sponsorship Program. What makes this conference so attractive to QNRF is its inherent interdisciplinary nature, as well as its focus on a singularly important subject for Qatar and the region. The question of what will follow the phase of Western-led globalization over the last 70 years is particularly felt in the MENA region. The intersection of nationalism, religion, and civil society, one of the topics of this conference, and how those various characteristics are best balanced will determine the success of the ambitious plans that Qatar has laid out in its Qatar National Vision 2030. What this conference does is to emphasize the instrumental role that the social sciences and the humanities have to play in providing pathways to answer such difficult questions of human interaction. At QFR&D, the promotion of research into public policies and governance models that enable peaceful and sustainable growth is a focus. As an economist by training, I'm very much aware of the impact that constitutional frameworks and governing environments have not just on economic growth, but also on the quality of life of citizens, which is not necessarily the same, even though this is often posited. We are all aware of constitutional designs and the role that the veil of ignorance plays in enabling stable outcomes. However, it is not clear what models of constitutional frameworks will provide the sought-after stability on a regional and global scale going forward. A conference like this and the discussions that you will have provides opportunities to address such central geopolitical questions for a region of vital importance to the globe. It's unfortunate that I won't be able to attend all the sessions of this conference due to other commitments, because I would have very much liked to learn from speakers on such topics as, to just name a few, civil society, migration, and social development, one of the core priority themes of our current NPRP call, and Singapore as a non-liberal electoral democratic state. But some of our program managers will be attending, and I'm sure they will learn a lot from the presentations and the discussions that follow them. Of course, we also hope, and that is one of the goals of the CWSP sponsorship, that a number of national and international collaborations in research on this topic will result from this workshop. At QNRF, we evaluate conference proposals in part on their potential to lead to research grant proposals down the line. Our funding model permits and encourages not just national but international collaboration. And we look forward to the high quality outcome of this conference, including future research proposals by the prominent researchers that have been attracted to this conference. Our thanks go to the organizers and the participants of this event. I wish you good luck and much success in the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you once again to the Qatar National Research Fund for being willing to provide support to this event. We're very appreciative of the interest you continue to take in the work we do here at Georgetown. And thank you all, of course, on behalf of the organizing team as well. We very much appreciate you being here and partaking in these discussions. We hope you can stay for the entire duration of the 2 days, or if not, to selectively engage with some of the key panels that we have on offer here for you in the next 2 days. Now, of all the macro regions of the Earth, the Indian Ocean world contains by far the greatest range of cultures and religions, of states and political systems. And almost certainly, as the Dean referred to, it will also be the stage on which the 21st century most consequential economic shifts, strategic confrontations, and political experiments will play out. Now, more than 2 billion people live in the countries along the shores of the Indian Ocean, and another 500 million or so reside in those countries directly adjacent to the oceanic rim. And it is therefore here that many of the key challenges that humanity will face in the next few decades will face their defining hour. Now, as we will hear from our keynote speaker, of course, there has been an extraordinarily cosmopolitan mosaic of empires that have dominated most of the Indian Ocean's history. And after experiencing a lengthy period of relative economic decline, the ocean today is once again surging in importance. And whatever the metric one uses, its dynamic character is unmistakable. The Indian Ocean, of course, has the densest flows of migration anywhere in the world. The region's trade routes from the Straits of Malacca to the Cape and the Suez Canal are crucial to global commerce. Key littoral states have been experiencing the fastest economic growth rates in the last 25 years. Old and new superpowers alike are, of course, increasing their military presence on and offshore. And, of course, the dramatic impact of climate change is already altering both weather patterns and coastlines in a macro region that is vulnerable like no other to global warming. Now, of particular importance to this conference is the fact that the Indian Ocean is also the fastest changing and most unpredictable region on the planet in terms of its politics, local, regional, and international. And the countries of the region, of course, range from the exceptionally successful city-states of Singapore and Dubai, and the powerful, enduring nation-states of places like Thailand and Iran, to violent fragmentation of statehood in places like Somalia or Yemen, with a great mixture of different experiences in between. And of course, at the center of the region lies India, which is not only soon to be the world's most populous country, but also importantly, its biggest democracy. And a bit further afield, of course, we have global and regional powers or re-emerging powers, whether China or Saudi Arabia or Ethiopia, that are exerting a huge influence on these littoral states, on regional trade networks, and of course on its increasingly militarized geopolitics. Now, no other macro region seems to be witnessing such potent challenges to different aspects of the US-led liberal order that has dominated our planet for the last few decades. The idea of the Weberian state, the practice and the theory of liberal democracy, the functioning of free markets, and of course the Pax Americana itself are all facing largely implicit but increasingly explicit challenges from a multitude of directions. And the most prominent, of course, include the rise of Daesh and its attempted jihadist caliphate, the sprawling organized criminal networks that tie together the Gulf and South Asia in a very particular form of regional integration, and of course the revisionism of the Islamic Republic of Iran in undermining much of the post-Sykes-Picot regional order in the Middle East. And so what we're seeing around the shores of the Indian Ocean is that states like Yemen have indeed collapsed, and that many governments are struggling to uphold more than nominal control over large swathes of their territory. And interestingly, this is not just happening in distant rural peripheries, but even very much at the center, at the very heart of the region's megacities. And in other places, of course, central authorities' holds might seem less fragile, but equally far removed from liberal fantasies. And we have neo-patrimonial governance systems that dominate in context of resource abundance, and of course the Gulf states are one such example, but also in context of great scarcity, and we can think of Bangladesh or Madagascar, And those, of course, also increasingly sinking into what economists call a middle income trap and the associated political paralysis in places like Malaysia or Thailand. Now, at the same time, the Indian Ocean and its edges are also home to numerous experiments in state building, in which elites are able to concentrate and project enormous amounts of political and economic power to give rise to new leviathans. From Singapore and the United Arab Emirates to Eritrea and Ethiopia, an important gamut of state builders are doing so based on illiberal recipes that differ resoundingly from the policy prescriptions associated with the so-called Washington Consensus. And the boldest such experiment may well be the project that Narendra Modi has been pushing in India since coming to power in May 2014. In Delhi, the current BJP government is pursuing a tempered version of free market reform, but it is also trying to reshape India along the lines of Hindu nationalism in ways that may greatly change the country and qualify its democracy. Now, in this conference, we are therefore examining these driving forces shaping the region's political experiments and its multiple conceptions of order and disorder. Now, the Indian Ocean world does not merely challenge conventional liberal accounts of globalization. It also compels us to re-examine the staying power of socio-political complexes that were supposed to wither or at least be reformed beyond recognition by that very same globalization. Kinship ties and nationalism, religion, and they remain very powerful forces shaping both the domestic and transnational environment along the oceanic rim. Tribalism and sectarianism appear to be recovering much of the ground they lost in the early post-colonial period when secular urban regimes and elites assumed the reins of nation building. And these tribalism and sectarianism are key ingredients in, of course, some of the cities of the Indian Ocean. Think of Bombay, of Karachi, of Johannesburg, that are making these cities some of the most dynamically pulsating places around the world, but also rendering them increasingly violent and fragmented. Now, let us, of course, be careful in this framing because, of course, the salience of identity politics in the Indian Ocean world should not be mistaken for a kind of post-sovereign order, at least not in the facile sense of the term. Sovereignty remains not only a key discourse to internally and externally protect illiberal state-building projects and clientelistic political economies in East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, but the enduring importance of sovereignty is also evident in the resoundingly pluralist international relations that characterize the ocean's geopolitics. Denser flows of people, ideas, and capital do not necessarily erode the pivotal role of state sovereignty in an ever more globalized Indian Ocean, but rather in many places lead to calls, and as we will see, increasingly articulate political projects that seek to strengthen it or to reinvent its basis. And therefore, this conference will attempt to identify the main patterns of this new era and suggest new analytical approaches to their understanding and articulation that go beyond the dominant Western shibboleths of the past generation. And what we are doing here is to seek to reframe the major fault lines of the new politics and to help develop more appropriate frameworks to understand the changes and experiments convulsing the ocean. Now, to do so, as you will have seen from your program, this conference hosts 6 thematic panels and 1 keynote speaker who I will introduce in just a minute. And as you can see from that program, our discussions will range from interrogating the Weberian state and its challengers to the future of neoliberal development strategies, to dissecting the ways in which religion, nationalism, and war are all changing. Now, the speakers and the chairs of our panels not only hail from across the Indian Ocean and indeed the wider world, they represent a truly outstanding group of scholars of a broad range of disciplinary backgrounds. And we are very privileged to have in our midst world-class political scientists, historians, anthropologists, economists, and international relations theorists. I personally could not think of a more exciting group of minds to discuss the future of the liberal state and its alternatives with. Now, perhaps there's no more exciting speaker on the program than, of course, our keynote speaker here with us today, Professor Thomas Blom Hansen, of course, a professor of anthropology with a very wide-ranging career and a very wide range of interests from political theory, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and comparative religion. a man who's worked, of course, in Edinburgh, in Yale, in Amsterdam, and now at Stanford, and I guess who's best known to most of us for his work, particularly in the urban environments of South Asia, with books like The Saffron Wave and Wages of Violence, as well as a whole series of edited volumes and special issues. But of course, in recent years, he's also done a lot more work in the African context, particularly in South Africa, having published very recently also on those links between religion, violence, political mobilization, and urban life. And Thomas is going to kick us off with some thoughts on one of the key themes of this conference, as I said, sovereignty, the future of sovereignty, and importantly, its past and what the Indian Ocean space can teach us about that. So without further ado, let us please welcome Thomas Blom Hansen here for the keynote address.
Thank you very much, Harry, for that kind introduction, and also thanks to everybody here, the foundation, the university, Anatol Lieven, everybody involved in this. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. So, in the time I have, and Harry, you must stop me, give me a 5-minute sign or something. I will try to address at least some of the issues that have come up in the concept note that we received, and I was very thrilled to say yes to come here, because I think it touches on or synthesizes a whole lot of different themes that I personally have taken interest in over some time. I'm an anthropologist by profession, maybe more of a historian by inclination. So what I will give to you is a set of sort of general reflections on the Indian Ocean, but also some examples from work I've done both in South Africa and in India. I also have some pictures, a PowerPoint, and some of the, I have to apologize to some of the pictures that look really lovely this morning. When I blew them up on the screen, look very severely challenged by deficient pixelization. So you have to bear with me, they don't look as good as they should. Okay, so let me begin with the Indian Ocean world and why it's important, some of the themes that Harry took up. It's clear that the Indian Ocean world has become all the rage in many academic and policy circles in the past decade or decade and a half. The literature, as some of you will know, is not short on hyperbole. The Indian Ocean has been called the original site of globalization. It's been called a counterpoint to Western hegemony. It's been called an alternative cosmopolitanism. It's been called a site of contending universalisms and so on, all of which have, of course, grains of truth in them. It's also true that Indian Ocean studies are proliferating across the world, and there are almost every year a new Indian Ocean research center opening. I think the last count is about 12 or 15 across the world. There was one in South Africa also more recently that has opened. Now, a very large chunk of these centers are actually headed and driven by people who are basically specialists of South Asia, especially of India, and that's not an entire coincidence. As Harry indicated, of course, South Asia is literally the elephant in the sea, in the ocean. It's the biggest chunk of land and people, but it's also some of the interest in the Indian Ocean has also, and some of the scholarly interest has also been taken up and articulated by successive commissions and initiatives from the government of India that try to craft a sort of regional collaboration body in the Indian Ocean. And some of you may, if you haven't seen this movie, there is an interesting documentary circulating on YouTube that's called Retrieving History, Shaping the Future, which seems to be a sort of just a general kind of documentary about the Indian Ocean. At the end of it, you learn that it's actually produced by the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi. And it does exactly this work of bringing together lots of policymakers from both Mauritius, Oman, South Africa, and India to talk about how there is a possibility of retrieving some of this older history in order to craft a new future. So some of the scholarly enterprise and some of the political interest in doing this are also converging, but at times also, of course, in tension with one another, which is where I would like to start, because in many ways, we should, as scholars, ask ourselves, what is it that this alternative, what is it this way in which to frame the Indian Ocean tries to do? There's been a lot of excitement among scholars to think of the Indian Ocean as a place to reconceptualize basic ideas we have, both of history and concepts in the social sciences, to think the world from the sea, from coastlines, from islands, and so on. But we should also ask, where does that come from? Now, it's clear that historians have been in the forefront of this, and many people inspired by the work of Fernand Braudel and the Annales School in France in the 70s and 60s, then work on the Mediterranean informed work on the Atlantic world, which has been very seminal in actually constructing, you could say, a new historiographical approach to oceans. And it was the Atlantic Ocean that set the pace. Historians here began to conceptualize the ocean not just as a connector of territories, but also as a space that became the very heart of the formation of all the world historical forces that we live with: modern capitalism, plantation economies, nautical and naval technologies, and of course the formation and consolidation of the modern state, and a new unitary conception of territorial sovereignty that then could be exported. Now, it's clear that many of the debates about the Indian Ocean implicitly or explicitly set itself up against this particular history or this particular idea of a European history that's based in the Atlantic world. And one of the clearest examples is that of a dear colleague and friend of mine, Eng Seng Ho, who wrote a very important book that was published in 2006 called The Graves of Tehreem, which is an ethnography of the Hadrami community and their successful trade empire and migration across the Indian Ocean world from the Qatari Sultanate in present-day Yemen. For Ho, this community's peculiar adaptation to the local circumstances and the economic ties, learning, and religious authority that Hadramis brought with them was in fact emblematic of an older Indian Ocean world prior to Western colonial domination. By contrast, Ho says, the Portuguese and later the Dutch and the British brought with them modern states based on systematic violence and subjugation as the very basis of sovereignty. What Ho doesn't highlight that much is the fact that centuries of infighting and strife in the Hadramat territories in present-day Yemen had produced a martial tradition that enabled Hadramis to serve as soldiers and mercenaries along the Swahili coast, in Aceh, in the Indies, and also in the powerful Nizami state of Hyderabad on the Deccan Plateau of India, where Hadramis became hereditary heads of police and security. This standing, in fact, on the Indian subcontinent translated to become a standing of the Hadramat Sultan in Yemen, who was the titular head of the security force in the Nizami state, and that enabled him to sign a treaty with the British in 1882, making Hadramat a British protectorate until Yemen became independent in 1967. And today, the same community actually form a part of the elite forces that are countering the Houthi rebellion in Yemen. So there's more to this story than just the Indian Ocean world being a less violent world, you may say. In this wide-ranging and richly peopled book, 100 Horizons, historian Sugata Bose extends Ho's argument to cover many parts of the Indian Ocean, to Bose an earlier and more collaborative ethos of trade and an earlier formation of Mughal and Safavid and Ottoman sovereignty was based on tribute systems of incorporation, and it was obliterated and changed by the advent of European imperialism, which aimed at naked subordination and the building of a centralized colonial state. This is Bose's argument. With that came also, this was based on the creation of the Indian colonial army as the most powerful army outside of Europe that was now charged with enforcing British colonial power from Manchuria to Iraq to East Africa. Paraphrasing Ranajit Guha's, the doyen of subaltern studies in India, his famous phrase, Bose suggests that the British established a certain dominance of the Indian Ocean world, but no hegemony, and his account documents all the alternative imaginings that Indian sojourners of the high noon of imperialism engaged in. Some are ordinary men and women, but many accounts are also the usual suspects: Tagore, Gandhi, Subhash Chandra Bose, and so on and so forth. Now, so in this and much other very, very fine scholarship, it's still as if the world preceding European intervention in the Indian Ocean world, or even after the intervention has happened, that there is something more fluid, even more gentle, respectful, and less violent about this world. And the implication is, of course, that this also makes it fundamentally different from the Atlantic world and prompts a rethinking of many categories. Now, I'm not one that would sort of believe this. I think if you look at the slave trade across the Indian Ocean in the medieval times and also early modern times and so on, that is questionable, and there are many able historians from Janet Abulagot to Sanjay Subramaniam who have worked on this period. For our purposes today, I'm more interested in what makes the European expansion into the Indian Ocean and East Asia different from the Atlantic or the Pacific story, and what configurations of sovereignty this made possible. Now, and I'll come to let me see. Here we are. First point to remember is that there was no obvious military superiority guaranteed for European powers until after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and its proxy wars on the Indian subcontinent. European expansion was almost exclusively based on domination of the sea, seeking security and bases on multiple islands, while establishing entrepôts on the mainland. Even these entrepôts were tenuous and entirely dependent on the maintenance of viable treaties with local rulers who also could overwhelm them with great ease. As a result, the colonial expansion in the Indian Ocean world began for the first couple of centuries as a protracted experiment with a range of different arrangements and forms of layered, shared, and partial sovereignty. Plantation economies in islands of Mauritius and Reunion, the entrepôts of the Persian Gulf, the Swahili coast, and of course, the gradual territorial domination across South Asia. The primary instrument was not naked conquest, but a range of local treaties that established trading rights and dominions in smaller territories. Later, let me just see, here we are. This is also an integration of the Indian Ocean into a worldwide global system of trade, of course, which we shouldn't forget. Later, as the territorial domination of India is consolidated after the end of the Great Revolt in 1857, the system of treaties proliferates across the Indian Ocean world in earnest. Most famous is the establishment of a system of princely states comprising as much as 40% of India's territory and population, each equipped with its own government and taxation, the bigger ones with their own police, army, and foreign ministers and foreign legations, all overseen and discreetly directed by the British resident. In the hilly and the peripheral regions of British India, other forms of government were enacted through tribal councils, headmen, small tribal kingdoms, under the protection of the crown. These forms of government and principles of indirect rule and limited autonomy were also applied to other parts of the Indian Ocean world. Sultanates and towns in the Middle East and Southeast Asia had been forced by cannon boat diplomacy to accept the status as protectorates with various degrees of obligation to the crown, such as the General Maritime Treaty of 1820 that establishes British protection of the Gulf region. And I have here a picture that would have shown you had you been able to see it. In fact, a treaty that was reached in 1829. It's kept in a museum somewhere nearby. Most of the British interest across the Indian Ocean world in the 19th century, including the vast Indian Army, was no longer under the direct control of the Colonial Office in London, but was run out of New Delhi, now effectively Her Majesty's government in the east. Across the Arabian Peninsula, Persian ports, and the Swahili coast, it was not British representatives, but Gujarati traders, Muslims and Hindus who served as the formal representatives of the crown, reporting directly to Delhi and calling in armed assistance to discipline local rulers who had shown signs of insubordination or had not protected British commercial interests as stipulated in all the multiple treaties that had been signed. So this complicated web of treaties, protectorates, and local rulers and indirect control grew out of an adaptation to the realities of an already existing web of partial overlapping and utterly unresolved sovereignty arrangement that has characterized the Indian Ocean world for a very long time. So how can we understand this world? And this is the British Empire in East 1919. And again, I apologize for the deficient pixelization, but you can get an idea of some of it. The islands are not really, and East Africa is not here, which is, I couldn't find a good map for that. So, should we accept Bose's proposition that this was domination without hegemony, or should we perhaps think of it as a form of hegemony that was exercised without open domination? I think the latter might be more fruitful. So let's begin with one claim that underpins a lot of studies of the Indian Ocean world, that somehow a seaborne, beginning from the sea, stands in contrast to ideas of the territorial European nation state. Now, the first lesson from studying the world that came into being in the 17th to 19th century is, of course, that building new forms of deeper territorial sovereign power in Europe was directly enabled, financed, indeed inconceivable without the global expansion of European powers. This is a point that has been well established by many, not a point that was, for instance, obvious to someone like Max Weber. We can come back to that. It's impossible to understand the durability and reach of British power in the 19th century without the same dominance of trade and naval power. It would not have been difficult at the time to find many military and naval men in Britain about a century ago or more who would argue that the biggest mistake ever made by the empire was, in fact, to abandon such sea and island trade-based domination in favor of a more large-scale territorial domination and the administration of millions of subjects directly under the crown. So the ocean was, in fact, where empire begins. It is not a challenge to imperial control, but actually its most important precondition. Certainly, that is true of the European presence in the Indian Ocean world, and probably also other earlier forms which we can discuss. Similarly, the offshore economies and tax havens that often today are portrayed as somehow illegitimate outgrowths of global capitalism are not aberrations, but rather pillars in the very way modern sea-based capitalism grew, from Jersey to the Bahamas to Mauritius, that today, due to its tax code and tax treaty with India, it has been the most important node in capital flows and foreign direct investments into India for the past decades. The grid of commerce and capital flows in the Indian Ocean today, Singapore, Dubai, Kuwait, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Macau, and so on and so forth, all began as nodes in the elaborate system of treaties that was codified and elaborated by the British Empire. Now, before I get to my examples, I just want to offer a few reflections on how we can more analytically understand this formation and how this came into being and what is the logic behind it. I think there are two distinctions that might be good to think with. On one hand, I think it's useful to make a distinction between pre-modern sovereignty based on public ritual and the public performance of loyalty and fealty to the ruler, as opposed to modern sovereignty based on the effective daily administration of territories and population. This is, of course, as you will know, the underlying theme of Michel Foucault's work, Discipline and Punish. But the de facto global configuration of sovereign power in the 19th and 20th century doesn't sit at all well with this underlying teleology in Foucault's work, that sovereignty inexorably will move towards a more intensive biopolitical form. And nowhere is this clearer than in the complex sovereignty arrangement of the Indian Ocean world. Clifford Geertz coined the term theater state for the tradition of statecraft of pre-colonial Bali that centered on the performance of ideals of balance and perfection in elaborate public ceremonies. For him, it was a commentary on what he saw as an impoverished form of thinking about state power in the Western tradition as centered on what he called wars, horses, and guns. However, the colonial state and the British state and the Dutch state in the Indies relied very heavily on very similar theatrics of pomp and circumstance and adapting local registers of authority to their own ends. Everywhere, in India and Malaya and the Indies, treaties and alliances with local notables and rulers were the bedrock of territorial control and security. Colonial states were constantly worrying about their own legitimacy, and the Great Rebellion across North India in 1857 only deepened this fear. So the system of treaties and indirect rule persisted. It also created a parallel aristocratic universe in the colony where hunting and arcane rituals of rule were shared by British military men and local rulers. This world, and had my picture been a little better, you could imagine what would have been on it, was of course anathema to the progressives of the day. In the 19th century and early 20th century, missionaries with abolitionist leanings, administrators enthusiastic about the rationality of empirical techniques of governance, social reformers, labor organizers, and so on. These groups all pushed for deeper reform, more intensive, more rational, and indeed also more moral governance of the colonial subjects and the colonial world. So the history of colonial rule in India, Malaya, and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean world was essentially structured by a protracted tug-of-war, you may say, between these two phases of the colonial state. On one hand, reformers pushing for deeper regulation and social reform versus conservatives pushing for a leaner colonial operation that relied to the largest extent possible on methods of indirect rule through local aristocrats and natural leaders, as well as the presence of an effective military force. And the debate was, in a nutshell, about this. Should the colonial state be an aspiring, modern, biopolitical, and caring state, or should it remain more like a colonial theater state, imitating local rituals of authority and hence enjoying more legitimacy? If this sounds vaguely familiar to some of the debates we are carrying on today, it's because it is. More or less a continuation of some of these debates. So the two phases of the colonial state also maps on to the second distinction one may think of between two types of sovereignty. And for me, sovereignty is not one thing. Sovereignty is a register of different kinds of techniques. And I think this is the only way we can understand what sovereignty does and is. So these two phases map onto these two different conceptions. On one hand, sovereignty over territory versus sovereignty over people. Both of these modalities, of course, were intensified with the evolution of the modern nation-state form and its technologies of bureaucratic permanence. But by the 20th century, you can't see this. Anyway, it was clear that the control over people and bodies had become far more important, but also far more difficult and challenging than territorial control. Now, the British hegemony over this space of the Indian Ocean world was essentially a territorial affair, maintaining the right of the British Navy to control the waterways, trading routes, ports, and entrepôts. However, this hegemonic form allowed large numbers of people to begin to move, mainly from the Indian subcontinent to other parts of the empire, as indentured laborers, as traders, pilgrims, sailors, and soldiers. And this presented a whole new problem of legibility that really comes to a head in the early 20th century about identification, legibility, responsibility. Who had responsibility over these brown bodies? The government of India, the colonial offices, or the colonial office in London, or the authorities in their new permanent or temporary place of residence. So let me illustrate some of these complexities by three examples I'll draw, and I hope I can race through them and give you a glimpse of both late 19th century and up to the contemporary through this. So let me begin with what is probably less known to many of you here. Now, if you look at the holding of the majority of capital assets in modern India today, you will learn that the vast majority are controlled by a very small concentration of trading communities from northern and western India. The most successful were trading communities from the western coast of Gujarat and Sindh, territories such as Kutch, Kathiawar, and Saurashtra, and this is what you see on this map. These were communities that successfully had exploited the new possibilities opened by British naval hegemony. These were both Hindu Banya communities such as Bhatia, Patel, Shahs, and so on, but also Sindhi traders, Parsis, smaller Muslim sects such as the Shia Bohras, the Qodiyars, or also known as Ismailis or Aga Khanis, who established themselves from Persia, Zanzibar, East Africa to Central Asia. Today, one of the largest bank in Pakistan is owned by a member of the Ismaili community. You can talk about, this is the age of original accumulation in South Asia. This is the age where this really happens. But also Memon communities from Kutch who rose to prominence in South Africa, and I'll come to them in a moment. What's less known today is that many of these communities arose from the complex network of very small self-governing princely states in this region of Western, what is today Gujarat. There were almost 200 states in Gujarat alone. Some of them were as small as a few villages, but still had carefully prescribed protocol and rituals to state, including how many gun salutes they should have when they enter the compound of the British collector, and so on and so forth. The old trading cities like Surat and the bigger princely states with thriving ports like Kutch, Bhavnagar, and Porbandar, the trading communities had for centuries enjoyed substantial self-governance through local caste and community councils, and also protection of the local ruling families. This allowed these communities to develop very intense, very elaborate codes of trust and mutuality that they deployed with great success in the oceanic trade and in their migration ventures. It also bound them back to their homeland in a very deep and enduring way through property, credit, philanthropy, marriage, and kin relations. And we can come to this, and there's been a whole debate about whether these Gujarati communities actually were cosmopolitan, and people like Ed Simpson, my colleague from London, has made a very strong argument that they're not. In fact, the trade across the ocean made them less cosmopolitan than they would have been, perhaps. But let me talk about the Memons. Memons today, and I just want to show you that this is, some of these states also had their own money. This is one another bill from the state of Wadhwa, which is a very small state that also gave rise to people, traders who are known as Wadhwanis, some of them very prominent and very successful in the US, for instance. Memons today, which is one community I want to talk about, number about 1.5 million people, equally divided between India, Pakistan, and about 20% living in various parts of Africa, UK, US, Australia, and Canada. They're a very tightly knit community with most members registered on an online database on memon.com. You can go and check it out. You have to get a password. That previously was printed every 5 years in the form of a telephone directory that was updated on a regular basis. This directory was used by traveling Memons as a guide to where one could stay, where one could ask for favors, support, and even credit when abroad. This community sees itself to this day as a global mini-society, largely intermarried and interconnected, their loyalties to the Memon community far overshadowing any other priority, nationality, or solidarity with other Muslims for that matter. Memons today constitute the single richest group of Asians in Africa. They make up the majority of recent lists of 40 richest families in Pakistan, while Indian Memons, still a very large chunk of the community, like other Muslims in India, have encountered very major obstacles in scaling up their businesses, also in the current climate, or not least in the current climate. Africa was central to the global success of the Memons. Memons were among the relatively marginal groups of coastal Gujarat that seized the opportunity for migration and trade in Eastern and Southern Africa. And let me just, here. Some of you, these are some Memons. They have a Hindu lawyer, this young fellow with a mustache. You may have seen him before. He's called Mohandas Gandhi. So thousands of Memons and other Gujaratis who opened small shops and imported foodstuffs and commodities from their networks in India, they proudly described themselves in these closing decades of the 19th century in the colonial language of the day as pioneers, as settlers in Africa, and so on, something that they are a little embarrassed about today. But still, the abundance of cheap land, economic opportunities, and the booming economy of South Africa and the discovery of gold and diamonds meant that Memons quickly prospered, began to operate ships between India and South Africa, and acquired very substantial holdings of land and commercial real estate. They graduated from being small Dukawala retailers to become major wholesale traders. By the 1920s, Memons had more or less cornered the market for building materials and agricultural implements and supplies across much of the country. Many small towns across the Afrikaner heartland of the Transvaal had Memon families and small mosques, and their integration into the Afrikaner farming economy in fact spared the community many of the indignities of apartheid legislation that came into force from the 1940s. A small mosque was set up in the 1880s in central Durban by a Memon trader, and it soon became expanded to the largest mosque in the southern hemisphere, open to all Muslims but entirely controlled by Memons. Relatives of the same group of businessmen had set up a charitable trust in Porbandar in 1884, and 6 years later it was decided to set up a branch in Durban called the Natal Porbandar Trust, whose aim was to collect funds in Natal and channel them back to India to be spent on education on the less fortunate members of the Memon community. 15 years later, charges of irregularities in the transfer and collection of funds emerged in Natal, and serious disturbances erupted back in Porbandar, but also in Durban. Local authorities in both places feared that the members of the two lineages on either side of this dispute would begin to clash in the streets. The local ruler of Porbandar, Rana Sahib, decided to intervene and order the settlement of the dispute in Porbandar as well as in Natal. Though strictly speaking a legal dispute on South African territory, all parties involved in India and Natal decided to abide by the order of the Porbandar ruler. Now, Porbandar is still the most important center of Memon identification today. Many Memon men in South Africa prefer to this day to continue the tradition of marrying brides from India, as everybody would say. During my time in South Africa, I met several Memon women who were born and raised in small towns in Sindh, in present-day Pakistan. When I remarked that they were not technically from India, but actually from Pakistan, my informants would invariably say, half-jokingly, well, for us, India is where we Memons come from. That's what matters. Whether it is in Pakistan or India today is not really important to us Memons. Now, my second example, and I raced through it, concerns, and this is the other side of the state, you might say, the question, the demands on the state from dealing with movement or people across the ocean, which my two last examples are about. The indentured labor system began in the 1840s, first with Mauritius, and soon Natal became the single largest importer of coolie labor from 1860s onwards. It was decreed that in every territory importing indentured labor on 10-year contracts, there should be an office of the protector of immigrants that would be charged with ensuring that employers were abiding by the terms of indenture and provided the minimum facilities for the workforce, such as food and shelter. 10 years later, Natal was by far the biggest importer, as I said, and it had created chaotic and unruly situations in Durban Harbor and on the rapidly expanding sugar estates where planters were unwilling to follow even the most basic rules. The Natal authorities didn't see the Indian coolies as their responsibility and claimed that they were a kind of free labor, but it was pressure from New Delhi and the Colonial Office that forced an investigation by the so-called Coolie Commission of 1872. The recommendation of this commission far exceeded anything that the government of Natal or colonial India had provided or would provide for its non-white subjects for many years to come. Laborers were given free medical care, free education to their children, supervision by the protector of Indian immigrants, and also 5 or 10 acres of land should they decide not to return to India upon the completion of their labor contract. This episode and the implementation of these recommendations of the Coolie Commission created much resentment among the white authorities in Natal and was a beginning of one of the longest rifts within empire. Over the next 5 decades, high population growth and immigration made the Indian population in Natal and South Africa the largest outside of India. That was true until a few decades ago. The resentment against what was seen as Asiatic penetration of white residential areas led to persistent demands for segregation and also for repatriation of Asiatics who white colonists saw a little bit richly. They saw them as intrinsically alien to Africa, whereas they themselves, of course, were not alien. The government's plans matured in the 1920s into something called the Asiatic the Asiatic Land Bill, which decreed complete separation of Asiatics, that is Indians and whites. And in fact, that is the bill that becomes the blueprint for subsequent apartheid legislations known as the Group Areas Act in 1948. Lots of people don't know this, and many white liberals in South Africa are not happy to admit that this is actually the precursor. It was just not just something that unenlightened Afrikaners came up with. This was part and parcel of how empire worked in South Africa. This gave rise to a lot of agitations. There was a national day of prayer was held throughout the country in 1926 among white people who were in favor of passing of this bill. But the South African Indian Congress sent a deputation back to India to mobilize political support for the cause of Indians in South Africa. Mass meetings were held in various parts of India to protest, and the Viceroy of India, Lord Reading, sent an official protest against the legislation. And interestingly, in this case, the government of India clearly, or as in previous cases, acted as an advocate of native Indian interests and pressed for a roundtable conference, which was held in 1926 in Cape Town. The Indian delegation, interestingly, consisted of 6 civil servants. 3 were Indian, 3 were British, and it was led by Sir Mohammed Habibullah. The South African delegation was, of course, all white. After protracted negotiations, the so-called Cape Town Agreement was signed in 1927. It stipulated a new voluntary repatriation scheme, and it also reiterated many of the recommendations of the Cooley Commission 50 years previously, that Indian education of Indians should be undertaken by the government and so on and so forth. But it also, interestingly, installed a permanent agent general of the government of India that, as you will recall, is Her Majesty's Government of the East. But this person should be posted permanently in South Africa to oversee that the agreement is implemented. Now, this issue continued to simmer, and it was actually at the heart of the big protest that erupted in 1946 that led to this being one of the first cases that was put before the United Nations General Assembly, where the South Africa delegation said this is a matter of internal domestic sovereign decision, you cannot interfere in it, whereas the Indian delegation, with great eloquence, argued in favor of the language of universal human rights, and this led to the first condemnation, the first set of resolutions against South Africa that eventually led to its expulsion of the UN and so on and so forth. Now, the question at the heart of this was whether Indians could be regarded as proper South Africans, or what the South African government called just temporary sojourners, although they had been in the country for almost 100 years. It was clear that the fate of the indentured laborers and their descendants once again had forced colonial governments, Indian and South African, to confront not just whose jurisdiction and sovereignty these people fell under, but also what kind of care, what kind of responsibility that, if any, the government was prepared to extend to these now formerly imperial subjects. It's noteworthy, by the way, that the government of independent India retained the office called now the Protector of Indian Immigrants. It's supposedly also supervising all Indians working abroad. We can discuss how efficient that is, but we'll get to this. My final example, and I raced through it, Harry, don't worry, it concerns the legacy of indirect rule, but more at the scale of urban governance in India. As you will know, the persistence of slums in a place like Bombay, but also Karachi and many other places, is not a new thing. These go back a very long time to the colonial era, and these were areas that were never subject to governance, enumeration, or policing in the way that other areas were. Most of the governance was done through local big men, either people who identified as pradhans, caste elders, tribal and ethnic headmen, self-appointed strongmen, and gangsters. This is a very old story. Who claimed authority and knowledge of slums and who offered their services as brokers and representatives to the city government and to the police. Now, this has become a sort of institutionalized form of, you can say, neglect or government at a distance, which enabled a range of informal economic and political networks to flourish in many of the popular neighborhoods in cities like Bombay, well below the radar of formal bureaucratic functioning. But instead of looking at such informal economies as a result of a weak state incapable of regulation, I think it's more fruitful to look at the informal markets and labor and services and people as integral to the very way formal bureaucratic systems and formal economy function as a permanent parallel reservoir of flexible and non-accountable options open to businessmen, police, and bureaucrats. I'll give you a quick snapshot of 3 minutes and then I'll wrap up. In the 1970s and 80s, kafalas, the labor contracts were issued to go and work in the Gulf, were issued to Muslims only. This came to a halt, I think, in the early 90s. Muslims in Bombay had been squeezed out of the labor unions and the textile industry by Shiv Sena militants since the 1970s, and Gulf employment opened a new income source. Many young Muslims had technical skills, but recruitment was always complicated. Most of the kafalas were handled by the well-established travel agents and businessmen, again, Memon, Konkani, border Muslims, who had direct kin-based contacts in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia, and it was these traders who handled the kafalas for a fee through a string of transactions. The same businesses also had lucrative business contracts with the Hajj Committee, and this is the Hajj House, again, I'm sorry about the quality, who also offered subsidies to poor Muslims in the form of discounted tickets going for Hajj. This practice actually had begun already in the 20s and was part of a larger effort at that time by the Colonial Office to frame the British Empire as a true friend and protector of Muslims worldwide. It later became a political perk, and many of the posts in this committee and this bureaucracy was actually occupied again by many of the successful trading communities, Muslim trading communities from Bombay and around there. To get a kafala, you had to jump through a lot of hoops, make a system, make payments at all sides, get certificates of skills and so on. And many labor applicants, hundreds of thousands of them at the time, were put up in hostels, cheap hostels, went through this process of certification before they could be issued their kafala. This entire system was nominally supervised by the Bombay branch of the Office of the Protector of Indian Immigrants, but inspectors rarely, only occasionally inspected offices and trade testing centers, and regular donations to these inspectors ensured that the system basically functioned as one large sprawling system of payments. Those who didn't pay up would be kept waiting or would return home indebted or without a kafala. But the system afforded the Muslim trading communities new substantial sources of income and patronage. It depended on and reinforced community ties across the ocean, but it also allowed the shadier side of the informal economy to recruit labor migrants to carry and smuggle goods and bullion across the ocean, and it afforded new groups of lower status Muslims new sources of income, new networks and contacts in the Gulf, and a welcome opportunity to compensate for the systematic marginalization at home. Now, it also fed into a long-standing idea of Muslims in Bombay and Muslims as a whole in India as basically people who work in the informal economy and who are all criminals. Badmashis is the local term for people who are gangsters or hooligans. And of course, the rise to dominance of, or rise to prominence of people like Dawood Ibrahim, who is pictured here, and this book from Dongri, which is a Muslim neighborhood in Bombay, and to Dubai, is of course emblematic of this larger literature that came out that fed this sort of stereotype of Muslims being involved in the underground economy. One of my informants, or many of my informants at the time, would say against the people who were promoting Hindutva or Hinduness, would say, well, they may call themselves Hindutvawadis, but we are actually Dunyawadis, which means we are supporters of the world, we are lovers of the world rather than lovers of Hinduism. Let me wrap up 1 minute. Now, I hope I've been able to draw your attention to the legacies of some of these complex sovereignty arrangements that have been the feature of the Indian Ocean world for centuries, including the continued existence of a whole range of very powerful and successful trading communities that to this day continue to shape connections across the ocean in all kinds of ways. As territorial boundaries were redrawn and resettled as nation-state boundaries across this world in the 1940s, the biggest challenge for nation-states became that of mobile people, as I said. Territorial maps and movements of people don't always coincide, and conflicts persist. such as the question of whether Indians are really South Africans or plantation Tamils are really Sri Lankan or Malaysian, and so on and so forth. In other cases, such as the historically most enterprised and creative communities of the Indian Ocean world that I talked about, the trading communities, have today become framed as security risks or even as anti-national elements in their countries of origin. So rather than looking at the Indian Ocean world as a site of a different cosmopolitanism to be retrieved from beneath 500 years of colonial domination, I think it's more fruitful to see the Indian Ocean world as integral to global capitalism and global dynamics of movement and sovereignty now, as well as in the past. But also, secondly, as a space where multi-layered historical complexity constantly are being reconfigured and reinterpreted. I've learned one lesson from working for many years in India: nothing ever goes away, including the legacies of colonialism. I think the same is true of the Indian Ocean world. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Thomas, for an outstanding, properly ocean-wide keynote, which we very much appreciate. Join me in thanking once again Thomas Blom Hansen.